Right, so plenty of reason to celebrate, it would seem, as finally the UN Security Council finally manages to pass a ceasefire resolution. But it's nowhere near enough in and of itself. There's so much more still to be done. And indeed, the biggest question of all is whether the UN will follow up on this ruling by now deploying peacekeepers to enforce it. The US, despite getting their own way by making it conditional upon hostages being released and it again only being a temporary month-long break for Ramadan, still wouldn't vote for it. Decided to at least abstain this time rather than veto it. Still too worried about Israel's reaction, presumably, because even they, like the rest of us, could have guessed how they'd lash out at this, and lash out they have. The UN is now anti-Semitic. The vote is anti-Semitic. The UN Secretary General, guess what? They're anti-Semitic. You know how it goes. A ceasefire, peace even, are now basically anti-Semitic. And it seems painfully obvious to all the UN peacekeepers will be needed to enforce this ruling, because there is zero sign or prospect that Netanyahu will follow it. Right, so we have a ceasefire of a sort. It's immediate, but it's temporary. Israel are pissed at the US for not devotedly vetoing this, so now Israel is acting in defiance of international law, or at least threatening to, if it doesn't down tools immediately. It is actually the most minimal ask to get some sort of ceasefire right now across the line, though, such as the ongoing pathetic performativeness by some nations on this matter, though. Here's what it actually calls for. An immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire. The immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as ensuring humanitarian access to address their medical and other humanitarian needs, and that the parties comply with their obligations under international law in relation to all persons they detain. The urgent need to expand the flow of humanitarian assistance to and reinforce the protection of civilians in the entire Gaza Strip. The Council reiterates its demand for the lifting of all barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance at scale in line with international humanitarian law. So essentially what we have is a humanitarian pause again, rather than a ceasefire, with an aspiration for the ceasefire to become permanent. Given this is as far as the UK were prepared to go, this is why they finally voted for something instead of abstaining. There are calls for all hostages to be released on both sides unconditionally, although it is conditional still because it's part of why the ceasefire passed. It's been one of the sticking points for the US, so by putting this in, this is what got them to abstain. The other sticking point I'll come on to in a moment. The last thing it demands is humanitarian aid, food, shelter, medical supplies be allowed in unimpeded. That is the one thing all UN Security Council nations have been on the same page over. The humanitarian crisis, the starvation, that has got to end. This is all the ceasefire vote passed, a temporary cessation of fighting, aid in, hostages released. It is the very barest of bare bones because that's all that they were capable of passing, to get everybody to vote for it, to stop it from being vetoed. But if enforced, it'll get the help in for innocent Palestinians. There was one attempt to amend this resolution made by Russia, incidentally, to try and get the word permanent attached to the ceasefire, but this, as always, fell. As minimal as this resolution is, though, let's, on one hand, celebrate the fact that something to help has finally happened, and there have been positive responses over this, and there is every reason to be pleased that something, at least something, is finally happening here. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, "The Security Council just approved a long-awaited resolution on Gaza, demanding an immediate ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. This resolution must be implemented. Failure would be unforgivable." Ball's in your court, sunshine, to make sure it does, then, eh? You and all UN nations, of course. Stating the obvious somewhat, I felt, but he's absolutely right. This needed doing like months ago, though. 32,000 innocent people, mostly women and children, are dead. Over 100,000 of them, if you include those that have been injured throughout this genocide. Let's not hang about any longer and add to that number anymore. Yemen, incidentally, were present for this vote as observers, those plucky Houthis. They hailed it, said it's only a first step, though, and must lead to a permanent ceasefire, which will take some doing, with the US only now being nudged as far as abstaining instead of vetoing. The US had some balls, incidentally, in their response after their abstention, because their representative said, "The United States fully supports these critical objectives. In fact, they were the foundation of the resolution we put forward last week, a resolution that Russia and China vetoed." Aha! So this was all their idea then, even though they didn't actually vote for it in the end. Funny that. Still, it's got across the line. They let this pass, they didn't veto it, and after 3 vetoes, that is still significant. But the reason for their abstention, we can surmise, is probably the same as the reason the Israeli UN representative gave in his condemnation of this vote, because of course he was always going to, because there was no condemnation of Hamas in it. There's a very good reason for that, in my view. I dare say it's a view shared by many watching this by this point, because we're nearly 6 months into this genocide, because it isn't Hamas killing innocent civilians in the tens of thousands here, is it? It is Israel. You can condemn Hamas for their actions on October 7th, still the subject of investigation, but there's no denying they went in and took hostages, and those hostages, under the terms of this ceasefire ruling, must now be released. But so must the thousands of hostages Israel hold as well. No matter what way you look at this, what blame can be attributed to Hamas for October 7th, there is zero moral high ground for Israel when they are more powerful, they are the occupying state, and therefore have an obligation for the people there who they have oppressed for decades, and whose homes and lives they have destroyed on a scale far outweighing anything Hamas did. But no, still, they whine that they are being picked on, that they are the victim, and every time they do it, my disdain for them just grows a little bit more. The whinging of Israel at the UN is one thing. What of Netanyahu's regime, and what have Hamas themselves actually said? But as far as Hamas go, you might be wondering whether they accept this or not, depending on the source. As far as our media here goes, their bias, nailed on and has been for months, is led by The Guardian's response that Hamas will apparently be emboldened to reject this ceasefire. But then you realise they're quoting an Israeli source, and that source happens to be their liberal Israeli equivalent, Haaretz, who, despite being quite condemnatory of Netanyahu and his actions in Gaza, draws the line at voicing anything positive to say about Hamas. But then, if you're like me and you know the bias held by such papers, you look for a better source, such as a source who actually have journalists in the area, on the ground perhaps, like Al Jazeera, who have reported that Hamas have actually released a statement on all of this. Wouldn't it be nice if the aforementioned papers mentioned that, maybe even published it? Their statement, as it happens, reads, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, the Islamic resistance movement Hamas welcomes today's call by the UN Security Council for an immediate ceasefire. We emphasise the necessity of reaching a permanent ceasefire that leads to the withdrawal of all Zionist forces from the Gaza Strip and the return of displaced persons to their homes from which they were forced out. We also affirm our readiness to immediately engage in a prisoner exchange process that leads to the release of prisoners held by both sides. In the context of the resolution's text, we stress the importance of freedom of movement for Palestinian citizens and the entry of all humanitarian needs for all residents in all areas of the Gaza Strip, including heavy equipment to remove rubble so we can bury our martyrs who have been under the rubble for months. Hamas calls on the Security Council to pressure the occupation to comply with the ceasefire and to stop the genocide war and ethnic cleansing against our people. Hamas reaffirms the right of our Palestinian people to establish their independent, sovereign Palestinian state with Al-Quds as its capital and the right to return self-determination in accordance with international resolutions and international law. Hamas appreciates the efforts of our brothers in Algeria and all countries in the Security Council that have supported and continue to support our people and work to stop the aggression and the Zionist genocide war." There's not an awful lot you can argue against there, I don't feel, not really. Of course, they need to do their part in all of this, and the proof of that will be in the pudding. But of course it takes both sides, and Netanyahu's rancid bunch, they're not happy bunnies at all. He's cancelled a delegation trip to Washington off the back of the US abstention, which was due to discuss the planned Israeli ground offence in Rafah, and it's been reported by Middle East Eye that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office lashed out at the US after it decided not to use its veto power, saying the move was a clear retreat from the consistent position of the US and that it gives Hamas hope amid flagging negotiations in Doha, Qatar, to reach a hostage deal. The US signalled earlier that it would support what it called the non-binding resolution, which calls for an immediate ceasefire during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. While the text also calls on Hamas and Palestinian groups to free hostages they seized, it does not directly link their fate to a ceasefire. Well, that would be the follow-up negotiations in Doha after the ones in Egypt fell through because Israel didn't bother to attend, would it? Netanyahu is cornered now and he doesn't like it because he's so used to getting his own way all the time, like a petulant child. No wonder he gets on so well with Donald Trump. He's not so cornered he won't still keep accepting US cash and armaments, though, although quite how that will work in practice now this vote has gone through will be interesting. I dare say it won't stop. But if Netanyahu does still, despite this resolution passing, go into Rafah, there must be all hell to pay after that. Did you notice the US attempted a get-out-of-jail-free card there, though? A get-out-of-jail clause. Non-binding resolution, as they called this. This resolution is in line with international law, and UN nations like Israel must follow it by law. Why else do you think they're so angry about this? It means something. It's not just a statement that carries no weight, because it does. And now peacekeepers, especially in light of the fact Israel have ignored the orders handed down to it by the International Court of Justice, must be deployed to enforce it, to ensure aid gets in, to ensure settler protesters cannot stop it, to mediate and oversee the freeing of hostages on both sides that Hamas have stated they are ready to do. So ball is in Netanyahu's court to do likewise. A clock is already ticking on this because this is not a permanent ceasefire. That ceasefire will only last a month. And if Israel are to obey the ruling at all, and certainly if the US has given Netanyahu a headache, it's also coming from the far-right zealots he went into government with. They're giving him a bit of a migraine too. Who else would come out with a statement calling this whole shebang anti-Semitic after all but the walking sack of lost marbles that is Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Israeli security minister? A big old case of nuts, if ever there was one. His statement is short but anything but sweet. The Security Council resolution proves that the United Nations is anti-Semitic and its Secretary General is anti-Semitic and encourages Hamas. Oh, be quiet, you worm. There's nothing racist about demanding your state stick to rules it signed up to as a UN member. You can't go around and expect people to take you seriously when you're literally saying peace is now anti-Semitic. They're not wanting to kill innocent Palestinians for the sake of taking out a few Hamas operatives is anti-Semitic. Frankly, no accusations from Israel on anti-Semitism can ever possibly be taken seriously anymore, because it's just become their own lazy go-to response whenever they get criticised. That's the response from Israel. They are the people keeping Netanyahu in power. That's what you've got to deal with to see this resolution enforced. So I sincerely hope the UN is paying attention, because without enforcement, this is not going to work. So will you enforce this? It's a question everyone should be looking to the UN now and asking. As for the US, well, given how ungrateful their precious Israeli allies are, they really ought to just get behind a proper permanent ceasefire now. Stop arming the spoilt, murderous brats, and whether Biden wants to or not, it seems the US and Israel are on some sort of collision course. So it's time they got on the right side of history and stopped playing games, as this video recommendation will tell you all about that ceasefire resolution they brought, what they actually brought, what they actually said, what they actually tried to do, and which they attacked Russia and China over for vetoing. See if you think they were right to do that, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.